Hey, everybody, it's Dr. Eric Balcavage. We're back for another edition of the Thyroid Answers podcast, and I have a return guest on today, Cynthia Thurlow. She is a certified nurse practitioner, and she has just come out with her new book, Intermittent Fasting Transformation, not transportation, but transformation. And I think it's on its way out. I don't know if it's officially out yet, right? But I did get the privilege of getting to read some of the book, and I think it's well done. It's told in kind of like story-like fashion, which is what I think a lot of people kind of resonate with, is that story discussion. So Cynthia, thanks for coming back on the podcast. We're going to talk about your book and maybe the pros, the cons of intermittent fasting, why it may work for some, maybe not for others. And if it's not working, what things they should think about. And then you can kind of tell everybody, we're going to talk about what the benefits of the book are, why this book is different, and when and where they can get the book. Is that good?
That sounds great.
All right. So first, can you do me a favor? Some people, it's possible, some people didn't hear I think it was episode 63 we did on intermittent fasting. So you can give everybody a background on you. Who you went from nurse practitioner to like mega star in the intermittent fasting space after your TED Talk. So can you kind of talk about who you are and how you got here and why people should listen to you about intermittent fasting?
Yeah, happy to. I am a Western medicine trained nurse practitioner. My whole background started as an ER nurse, and then I transitioned into cardiology and worked in clinical cardiology for a very large private practice group in the Washington, D.C. area, and did both hospital-based and clinic-based cardiology. And I love everything about the heart. And I always start these kinds of conversations saying there's nothing that I find more interesting than the way the heart works and physiology related to it. And I think after becoming a mom, I really started to look a little differently at our kind of reactionary practice traditionally here in the United States. It's not to suggest that there isn't a need for emergent and urgent care, because there is, but we do a really terrible job of preventing disease. Hugely problematically, it's huge proliferative problem. And so once I became a parent, my older son developed life-threatening food allergies. And as you can imagine, for any parent who's gone through this, I was instructed by my Western medicine trained peer to carry an EpiPen and pray. And that was not exactly the mindset a younger mom wants to be in, that you're fearful that if you take your child to a restaurant or a friend's house, that they could potentially be exposed to something that could make them very sick or kill them. And so I really dove down a rabbit hole about looking at the impact of our nutritional choices, because obviously at that time he was being breastfed. And so my first question was, is it something I'm eating? Is it something I've exposed my child to either in utero or through breast milk? And I was always told no, it had nothing to do with that. And so I dove down this rabbit hole and started a PhD program and didn't enjoy that. And then did a wellness coaching program, which I didn't love. And then I read a book called Eat the Yolks. And I reached out to the author and said, where did you get your training? This is the antithesis of everything I tell my patients, but fundamentally, I know this is right. And so she told me where she got her training. And so I went down a program. It was a functional nutrition program, and that lit me up. And that was the beginning of the end of me, being in a more traditional role. And so I, stuck it out for a while, and my colleagues were semi-supportive of my desire to talk to patients about nutrition. I kept saying it all starts with food. We're not looking at the right thing. And so in 2016, I literally woke up one morning and said, I can't write another prescription. And my husband was shocked. I had no business plan. I just leaped and said, I know I'm going to be successful. That was maybe confidence or arrogance or stupidity. I'm not sure. But retrospectively, it was the right decision for me. And so I pivoted and created programs and one-on-one work with women who were really looking for a degree of support they were not getting within the traditional medical model. And then in 2018, I decided I wanted to do a TED Talk because as an introvert, it was something that would be challenging. And I always loved public speaking, which probably sounds like it would be counterintuitive, but as an introvert, it's a good exercise. And so I was offered my first opportunity to do a TED Talk in Toronto 2018. And at that time I accepted a second. And so my first talk is on perimenopause, but that's not what I'm known for. My second talk is on intermittent fasting. And prior to that talk, I got very sick and almost died. But I told my children that one of the reasons why I knew that I healed enough to get out of the hospital was to be able to go on and do that talk 27 days later. And so what I've become known for is really talking about intermittent fasting. And to me, it's a complete extension of all of this medical training that I have, and really focusing on metabolic health and metabolic flexibility as being the way that we as a society are going to be able to remain healthy. 88.2% of us, and this is a study based on 2018 data, I'm sure it's worse now, 88.2% of Americans are metabolically inflexible. And so I want to be part of the voices that help change that. And intermittent fasting is one strategy that can help support metabolic flexibility. And so that's kind of the platform that I stand on. And this book is really an extension of that talk that went viral, and the program that I created in response to a lot of interest in having, mostly women that wanted to work with me and find out like what were the strategies that were effective, what worked, what didn't work. I always said the N of one, bio-individuality rules. I know that's something that you and I both embrace, that it's really important to, just figure out what works best for us. And it might be what works right now. It may, there might be strategies we use right now that may not work at other points in our lives, but finding innately what works best for our bodies and for our hormones and for our sanity and for our, wellness. And that's really what it all comes down to, is helping women get empowered, get inspired, get educated about how to, make these transitional periods in our lives as healthy as possible.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. And there's a couple of interesting points. It's like when you're talking about, it's interesting in the world we live in today, right? Where if you have a differing view from the people who are kind of dictating the discussion, people are canceled, people are shut down, their profiles are removed, they lose licenses because they're not talking with the mainstream sciences. And that to me, it's always funny or aggravating to hear that, hey, somebody said something, so they got shut down, they canceled it. Like, isn't science all about having a hypothesis or a theory and then actively trying to almost prove it wrong in an effort to maybe show that it might be correct, right? But we don't know anything definitively or absolute certainty, because in healthcare and medicine, we find out what we did today, 10 years from now, we're going to find out that was like the worst advice. Like, hey, let's have everybody eat every 2 to 3 hours and that will maintain blood sugar. And what did it do? 20 years later, 70% of the US population is overweight or obese. Maybe that was really bad advice. And yet at the time of the day, that was the science, right? That we all followed because we didn't really ask that many questions. And then when you talk about the book, Eat the Yolk, I mean, fat? Are you kidding me? Fat makes you fat. Aren't they listening to what's being taught and told? And then you start talking about intermittent fasting, and people are like, oh, you can't do that. You have to eat every 2 to 3 hours. And it's crazy that in a world where we have more ability to get a voice and get a conversation going, I think we're more censored now about what we say about healthcare than we've ever been. I mean, it's crazy. It's craziness, right?
Well, and I think I was raised in a house where we had some pretty vigorous debates. And my first degree I was a poli-sci major and intended to go to law school. And I'm grateful I didn't make that decision to go to law school. But I also trained at a medical university system that encouraged vigorous debate and encouraged us, even as nurses, to question everything. And so to me, I will always be one of those people that's going to, I won't embrace cognitive dissonance. Although I recognize why that happens, I think it's important for people to, sometimes say, well, maybe that isn't the right answer. I mean, I make fun of myself all the time on Twitter, talking about the things I used to tell patients, the fat is bad and, eat lots of healthy, complex carbohydrates and, eat to stoke your metabolism and, make sure you pack your snacks and your mini meals. And I could not be farther from the truth. And I say all the time that part of evolving as a human being is acknowledging that maybe you didn't know, maybe, but now you do. So I always say, once you've seen, or once you've read, or once you've been inspired to think differently, you can't go back. And that's what I was starting to struggle with clinically. And I'll be the first person to say, I have lots of traditionally trained peers that are doing amazing things, but we don't do a good job with prevention. We do a terrible job. And we do a terrible job with chronic disease management. You know, I was called last night by a close friend of mine that I grew up with, and she shared labs with me and asked me what I thought. And I was so angry when I looked at the labs, because we recognize that by the time you develop diabetes, that process has been going on for 10 years at least.
Oh, yeah.
And her doctor or healthcare professional missed it. And I thought that was just, and I said, but this is fixable. I was like, so I'm not worried. We're going to help fix this. But, you know, we don't do a good job with, managing diabetes. I recall when I trained in Baltimore at a big research hospital, there were some visiting postdocs from Australia, and I became friends with them. And this one MD PhD said, I don't understand. You have the best healthcare facilities in the world, and you guys do such a bad job with, and he listed off like 5 things: asthma, diabetes. And I remember it really stayed with me that another Western trained colleague was acknowledging that there are limitations with our own medical model and medical system here in the United States. And so that really stayed with me for a long time. And, you know, I think now there are more of us that are speaking out, and it's becoming more commonly accepted that nutrition is really at the forefront. Lifestyle medicine is really at the forefront for health and wellness. It's not prescribing medication, and there's no shame if you need to take a medication for your thyroid or otherwise, that's okay. But this kind of traditional medical model where we prescribe medication for a symptom as opposed to looking deeper is one that is going to bite us in the butt. And it's already happening.
Already has.
We're an unhealthy population.
Yeah. And I think the problem is we don't have a uniform definition of what health actually is. Mm-hmm. And I heard on a podcast somebody say, or I don't know, I don't listen to the news, so it must have been a podcast. Somebody say, you can be healthy at essentially any body size. You can be overweight and healthy. You can be, and I'm like, this is the freaking nonsense that we're teaching. You can be, let's say overweight, but if you're overweight, what does that mean based on the chart? Well, the weight chart, if I have more muscle mass, I may be heavier than a weight chart says, but if you have obesity, if you have excess body fat, you're not optimally healthy, right? So we don't have a good definition of what health is. I think it's one of those things we look at and say, well, you're healthier than the other person I'm taking care of who's on 6 meds. You're only on 4, so you're healthy. Or I've hammered your lab values back into range with these 6 medications or 20 supplements, and therefore you're now healthy. That's not health. Optimal health is being able to go outside, thrive in your environment, not require additional medications. And that's not to say, as you said, it's bad. Well, I need a thyroid medication. That's great. And it's helping you maintain a healthier state because you had some dysfunction and you may need it. But that doesn't mean you're as optimally healthy as the person who doesn't need it, because they can go off. If you go into the Alaska wilderness, the person who's optimally healthy can survive without the stuff. The person who needs that, requires it, is not going to be in great shape out in that wilderness potentially. So I may have a skewed definition, but the issue is we don't have a great definition of what health really is. We say the absence of disease, right? Or the absence of symptoms. No, I mean, we have people all the time that have cancer, right? Or have developing disease and have no overt symptoms that they're aware of. And we have diseases that are occurring for 5, 10, 15 years. You talk about diabetes, it's a process. Thyroid physiology, it's by the time somebody is diagnosed with primary hypothyroidism, they've lost 90% of the function of the gland. That is not the beginning of a disorder or a disease. That's the end of it. And I was very anti-medicine because I came from that field, and I was very angry, but I'm softer now. Calm my issue, because I realize what allopathic medicine is really focused on. It is focused on acute care. And it's focused on help managing disorders, symptoms, and diseases as the person kind of regresses, right? As they age, and try and make it more comfortable for that person. But it's not healthcare per se.
Right.
And that's where we have to be okay with that and say, hey, that's crisis care. For the person who doesn't want to make any changes, that's exactly the type of care you need. If I get in a car accident, that's the care I need. But if I really want to optimize my health, that model does not work. We need to be looking at diet, lifestyle, nutrition, the things you were talking about to improve our health, raise our level of health on that health spectrum. And that's the role of functional medicine. I think if we think about it that way, now it's not allopathic versus functional medicine. Instead, it's, hey, how can we figure out how to get people to work together? Keep your medically trained doctor, because we may need them. But in the meantime, let's try and keep you as healthy as possible to avert disease, not need that crisis care, but they're there when we need them. Or it's there for the people who don't want to put a lot of time and effort in to try and maximize their health. Would you be okay with that concept?
Yeah, I think the thing I struggle with right now, and having trained in an inner city, this is obviously something that made an indelible impression on me, is that we shouldn't have to pay thousands and thousands of dollars a year to get integrative or functional medicine care. That should be part of our healthcare system without question. If people want to be more allopathic in their approach, totally fine. If people want to do the functional integrative approach, that's fine too. But what I start to get concerned about is that there are people who can't afford that type of lens to see, health and wellness. And so I start to think about, like, this really should be consumers and providers demanding not only that they have the ability and the flexibility to have reimbursement for these services, but that the healthcare providers take control back. Because a lot of what many people don't realize is that for many years, healthcare providers kind of were hands off with the insurance companies. And now the insurance companies are the ones that mandate, really poor reimbursement for services. If you get a bill from, your healthcare provider and it shows you what they charged, and then they get like a menial amount of reimbursement, and then you have your portion that you have to pay for, you recognize the model's really broken. And so I would love to see, this might be wishful thinking, but I would love to see there be access to more than just those that can afford it, to have the ability to have functional integrative medicine options and have reimbursement by insurance, not only for the healthcare provider, and reimbursement at a level where it should be, because we should be looking at a model that really is focused on prevention and wellness. And it's not, it's all disease management and chronic disease management. And the healthier people are really feeding into a system where they're not using the service as much. And then you have, other people that are using a lot more of it because they've, gotten farther along the disease process. So I do agree with you. And I think on so many levels, I think we would be healthier if we were having conversations with children in school, not my plate, which is complete crap, and acknowledging that part of what my plate is a reflection of the influence of big ag and subsidized foods, et cetera, which is a whole separate topic. But I think it's important for people to understand that we really have to start people at a young age, talking to them about nutrition and talking about what real food is, and, having alternatives. Because I can tell you now, I have teenagers, when they were 10 and under, it was very easy to moderate what they were eating and what we ate at home. And now they're one's in high school, one's in middle school, and they go to friends' houses and they've never had Doritos, and all of a sudden, like, their taste buds go bananas. And so acknowledging that we're fighting in many ways kind of a losing battle, because the processed food industry, as one example, is fueling a lot of the potentially preventative diseases we could be avoiding. And so there's so many variables. Like, it's something that I find fascinating. I always say, like, if I didn't have the clinician hat, I think I would be a health policy person, because you start to acknowledge, like, we really are like a cog in a wheel. And I think there are a lot of healthcare providers, probably many of whom listen to your podcast, and feel the same way, that in many ways you feel a little bit powerless because you acknowledge the system's broken, you acknowledge it needs to change, but it's so many things that need to change to make that possible. And a lot of people, I had a lot of patients that would look at me, and I would try to think of any angle I could try to influence them to go to bed earlier, change up their diet, exercise, even just walking. I was like, heck, we can all walk, right? We don't require anything other than supportive shoes. And I was shocked at how many 30 and 40 somethings would just look at me and they'd be like, Cynthia, I really respect you and I like you, but I'm not going to change my diet. I'm not going to stop smoking. I'm not going to go to bed earlier. I'm not going to, not work the night shift. So just give me my prescription and then we can check the box. And to me, it's so much conditioning that we've done of our patients that's their expectation. It's like, I'm going to go get my pill. I don't have to change anything else. And really it should be the reverse. Like the really hard work is doing the stuff, the lifestyle medicine piece that we're talking about. It's much easier just to take a pill and call it a day.
It's easier to be sick.
My experience.
It's easier to be unhealthy than sick than it is. It's a lot more work to put into it. But I think, is that the only way to start to fix this is to start to stop having a third party pay directly for your services. Because when somebody else, you're still paying, but you don't realize it because you put your card out there, it's maybe it's $10, it goes on a credit card. There's no exchange of actual money, right? It's all plastic and transfer. So you don't see it. You don't even think about the money that you pay in insurance, right? Until you have to pay cash or you have to pay for something that's not covered. And people sometimes I don't think that they realize that their insurance continues to go up and up, but the benefits and the value of it keeps going down. So when you have to take $100 bill out of your pocket and pay for a service, and you say, this is really not, it's $100 I'm giving them, and I'm not really getting better, even though I'm coming here, maybe there's no value here. But because I asked a question, I'm sure you ask it, why do you continue to go back and see the same physician if you're not doing better? And they're like, because my insurance covers it. Okay, but why would you still go for a service that doesn't benefit you? Because my insurance covers it. Yeah. Okay, if you had to pay for that service, it's a $200 or $300 office visit. Would you pay for it if it was coming out of your pocket in the moment? Absolutely not. Okay, then why do you keep doing it? You're still paying for it. You're paying it in your monthly payment that you're coming out from your paycheck or whatever. But I think we have to get back to I date myself back to the old days where you took money out of your pocket and you gave it to somebody because that's an exchange of service. And now it doesn't matter if I'm charging somebody $400 for my hour or $600 or $800 for my hour. The only people that are going to pay for that are the ones who are getting value of it. And when people return to valuing the service versus doing it because they believe a third party's paying for it, or they have to do it because of somebody else, but because they get to make the choice, that levels the playing field. Mm-hmm. Now, if we then say, okay, now any of those claims could be submitted to insurance and they can be refunded. Now I think we've got something, but I think any model that the insurance is paying and not direct pay by the client takes the person kind of out of it and thinks it's somebody else's responsibility and they don't have a say, or they lose the value for the service. And I think that's how we have to start that conversation. Even if we go to an inner city, that person, or out into the rural suburbs where the person doesn't have a really comfortable living. They're living paycheck to paycheck. But if they have to pay for their doctor visit or pay for a carton of cigarettes, at some point they're going to go, okay, I like smoking cigarettes. They're addictive. I enjoy it. But if I smoke these, I got to spend more time at the doctor's office and I have to pay for those visits out of pocket. Now I can't afford both. Something has to give. And I think more people will start to go, I can't afford to keep doing this bad habit if it's costing me and taking more money out of my pocket. I just think that that's how we have to start the conversation. It's not popular.
I think it's hard for people to understand that a lot of the lifestyle medicine stuff that we talk about, they don't see the net gain right away.
Mm-hmm.
And we are very much a hedonistic culture. We want those dopamine hits. We want it. We want the impulse now. Like that's why we smoke the cigarette. That's why we engage in unhealthy behaviors is one example. And so I really think you have to think about lifestyle medicine or those choices. It's like we're putting money in the bank. I mean, that's the mentality. I was trying to explain this to my teenagers who laugh about this. I'm like, I'm telling you, you're going to be your mom and dad's age before you know you're going to blink. Because we talk a lot about like retirement and, investing and making sure they understand, like you have to start at a young age. And it's very much the same way when it comes to these lifestyle choices. We may not see the returns right away, which is why it makes it harder for us to say like, well, why do I eat organic? Or why do I choose to be gluten-free? Or why do I choose to abstain from alcohol? Insert whatever it is you do. Or why do I choose to get up to go to the gym before I go to work? Or why do I choose to really focus on high quality sleep? You don't necessarily see the gains right away. And so I think we have to really think about health as a long game and not, it's not a sprint. And so
I totally agree with that. And I think that goes to the whole lifespan, health span, disease span conversation, right? Regardless of the choices you make, we have the technology in place to keep you to live in your 70s, 80s, or 90s, but it's the quality of life. And just like you can spend all your money when you're young, but then when you're older, you're going to be living in essentially poverty for an extended period of time. And really what you want to do is be able to live a really great life in that second half, right? And so it's exactly like investing. And some people are into it. No, I'm going to live my life now. Same with diet, nutrition. It feels good. And I get it. I totally get it. The problem is with nutrition or finances, you rarely ever hear the person who's dying say, I am so glad I made all those bad choices early on in life so I could struggle like this in my older age. Yeah. They don't. Typically, somebody who's really struggling really starts to regret the choices they made and say, I wish I had, right? Same with finances. I had so much fun when I was young, but I never saved. And now I don't have the money to do the things I want to do or give things to my kids or my grandkids, and they live a life of regret. And so, I think it's a great analogy. And unfortunately, it doesn't always pay off in the immediate. Like exercise. People are like, well, it hurts to exercise, right? But the immediate payoff is maybe some discomfort, but the long-term gain is what we see later. I live longer, I live healthier, I sleep better, all those things. So listen, I want to talk about the book. I want to talk about strategies in the book. You and I could geek out all day on this stuff and never even talk about the book. So I want to make sure that we do that. I'm not levitating. I'm just lowering my seat so I can get into this. So the book is, you did the book, right? So can you give somebody like a summary of what the book is about? Like, obviously it's about intermittent fasting, but usually we talk about like, there's a goal, and we talk about 3 pieces to a book. So what's the book about? What's the benefits for somebody to get and why they might want to read the book?
Well, it's really the first book that's written from a woman's perspective about women and fasting. And so that's the very unique, fresh take on it. It really dives into my story because I tell everyone that, I think on many levels, intermittent fasting was part of my middle-aged, salvation. And so, having never had a weight problem until I hit perimenopause, like a wall. And so there's part of my story kind of woven into it, but really talking about what it is about fasting that is so beneficial for the body. So we dive into benefits, we dive into the science. I was a constant battle with my publisher, not a battle with her. She's wonderful, but a battle with me feeling like I could make it very sciencey, but I wanted it to be approachable. I wanted anyone to be able to pick it up and understand the concepts and methodology. But what the book eventually evolves into is really IF45, which is a 45-day program of, for people, whether they're new to fasting or they've been fasting for a long time, really giving them the best strategies to be successful, whether it's about nutrition, whether it's about lifestyle, troubleshooting, what foods to eat. There's over 50 recipes. And yes, they lean very much into the carnivore-ish space. That was, again, something I really fought hard for because most, if not all, women don't eat enough animal-based protein. And so that was really important to me. but also leaning into the hormone piece. I know that you obviously have a whole podcast devoted to talking about thyroid hormone, but really talking about some of the, more common hormones that women would be familiarized with, thinking about oxytocin and insulin and cortisol, and then, the sex hormones, and diving into sleep hormones and satiety hormones and all these hormones, and how it's this amazing orchestration within the body when it's done right. And when it's not, that's when we start having, some of the things we were alluding to, this metabolic inflexibility. So it's really a book written to be accessible, informational, with actual plans. I've got challenges in there. I think it's always important to challenge ourselves. I'd be the first person to say we don't eat the same food every day. We don't exercise the same way every day. Once we're fat adapted, we don't fast the same way we do every day. It's really important to shake things up.
Yeah. So I think for some people, they're thinking, okay, what's the difference whether what's the difference? Let's do this. What's the difference between time restricted eating and intermittent fasting? Just do that, because I think there's some kind of little bit of discussion as to they're different things. And so if people get confused as to what they are, I know we talked about it on episode 63, but let's refresh that again.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's semantics, to be honest with you. I think the terms are used interchangeably. When you're talking about time restricted eating, there's a time in which you eat and a time in which you don't eat. That's as simple as it can be. Intermittent fasting is a term that excludes the word fasting, integrates the word fasting. So sometimes that can be a triggering word. I jokingly say, if you want to talk about fasting without saying it, say eat less often. Mm-hmm. And so it's just, again, periods of time in which you're eating and periods of time in which you're fasting, with you having control over when they are. This is an important distinction, that the flexibility piece, whether you're time restricted eating, and I'm going to put that in air quotes, or using intermittent fasting, that the terms are interchangeable. And I find more often than not, when you're talking to other fasting experts, we typically don't use TRE, we use IF, just because it's very clear that there's if you're intermittently fasting, it is very clear what it is that you're doing, versus time restricted eating. People are like, I don't know. I don't think it's as clear, but again, we're getting back to semantics. And so those terms can be used interchangeably by a lot of people in this space, but really they're speaking to the same methodology of there's a period of time in which you eat and there's a period of time in which you do not eat.
Yeah. And I think everybody has their little, what happens here is people have their definition of what it is. And then we start to cloud and muddy the waters. Like, my program is better because it's TRE and yours is IF. And so mine's better because hers is different. Or we also start to see the kind of the dogma starting to surround what the time frame should be for everybody, as if it should be the same and it has to be every day. You can't have flexibility to it. And I think one of the things you said is really the goal, and I know you and I have talked about this before, is to create metabolic flexibility, meaning when you are eating, you metabolize that food calories, convert it into energy appropriately. And when you're not eating, you're able to use the stores that you already have to fuel the body, and not have the oh no moments where you're now having crashes, you're getting reactive symptomatology, and having those hangry moments. It's interesting, once you start wearing one of the, like a continuous glucose monitor, I have patients wear it and they're like, when I thought my blood sugar was low, it's already high when I'm wearing this thing. Like, wait a minute, what's going on? I'm like, yeah. Your body's already fixed that out. You got epinephrine rushing through your system. The reason you have the symptomatology is because you've dumped a ton of epinephrine out there, probably to help regulate this emergency need for glucose. They're like, oh, I'm like, yeah, you probably don't need to eat when you think you do. Some people do, obviously that's different situations, but what I find for my patients that wear it, they go, by the time I'm having symptoms, my blood sugar's already high. Yeah, your body's pretty cool. It'll figure that stuff out, right? Absolutely. So the goal is really, with time restricted eating or intermittent fasting, however you want to say it, is trying to retrain your body from constant need for food every few minutes to every few hours to being able to manage with or without food optimally. Is that fair enough?
I think it's completely fair. And again, we've done a terrible disservice to our patients, convincing them that they have to eat frequently. And we have largely kicked out metabolic flexibility with the meal frequency that we have encouraged patients to abide by. And dare I say, the overwhelming amount of farm subsidized foods that proliferate in the food, processed food industry. So we've convinced people to abstain from fat, and fat is satiating, and to focus in on, I always say non-fat and low fat is generally things I don't recommend, because if they take the fat out, what do you think they add in? They add in more sugar. And so just the realization that this impacts satiety cues and impacts hunger. And much to your point, I think wearing a continuous glucose monitor is one of the most invaluable investments you can make in yourself. I wear one episodically throughout the year, but it's always interesting, even for myself, who is metabolically flexible. If I have a bad night of sleep, it shows up in my blood sugar. If I have a stressful day, interestingly enough, if I have my lights on in my office and I'm recording later in the day, my blood sugar will respond accordingly, because I'm probably excited about presenting or probably excited about talking. And in response to that, cortisol goes up, insulin goes up. It's fascinating, but I think it can be a really valuable investment. So I'm glad that you're finding that the insights that your patients are receiving is so helpful.
So let's talk about a couple of things in the book. One of those is you talk about the 4 bad dogmas when it comes to food, nutrition, dieting. So can you cover those 4 and give a little example of each of them?
Yeah. Well, breakfast is the most important meal of the day. And unless your breakfast is protein and some healthy fats, breakfast is probably contributing to this metabolic inflexibility. The processed food industry, I think about Kellogg's as being a really good example of this. They obviously, most of their products are processed sugars, cereal, Pop-Tarts, etc. And so when you consume these types of foods first thing in the morning, you're going to get this massive insulin spike and correspondingly blood sugar spike. And you're not going to be satiated. You're going to be hungry an hour or two later. You're going to be looking for the next thing. You're going to be looking for that sugary coffee, frappuccino, or a candy bar, or as Ken Berry likes to call protein bars, carbohydrate bars. You're going to be looking for something like that to satisfy the lack of satiety, the lack of hunger signaling cues, because what you've consumed is a bunch of sugary junk. I jokingly refer to oatmeal as dessert, which angers my 16-year-old who loves to eat that for breakfast, but he's incredibly metabolically flexible, and he usually eats some sausage with it, but he's also growing, and so very different. But I like women and men in particular to understand that first meal of the day should not be which is traditionally thought of as breakfast food: bagels, muffins, danishes. It's about the worst thing you could start your day with.
I think, we've educated people to believe that those are breakfast type foods. And I think a really important thing for people to understand, which I don't think is often talked about, we hear this, everybody thinks they're in adrenal fatigue when the adrenal glands actually don't fatigue. But the issue is that for most of us, if we're functioning somewhat optimally, there's a cortisol awakening response in the morning. And what that means is that your body says, hey, it's time to get up. We're going to jack the cortisol levels for the first 30 to 60 minutes of the morning to make sure we got enough fuel to turn all these systems on, right? So you don't need all that excess carbohydrates in the morning because the body is already kicking that into gear. I know you're well familiar with the cortisol awakening response. Would you agree that that's probably if you're adding the carbohydrates to a system that's already raised cortisol, and cortisol's job is to raise glucose already. So I eat high carb food that increases glucose, plus I've got my body's natural rise in cortisol, which can raise glucose. Plus, if I'm stressed in the first part of the morning, I can increase something called epinephrine, which also increases cortisol or increases glucose. So can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting, they call it the CAR, this cortisol awakening response. And I can see it even on my continuous glucose monitor. Like right when my alarm goes off, I look at, here's where my blood sugar has been trending and then I get this little bump. And I remind people that you want to think about when you're looking at data on a continuous glucose monitor, it's letting you know you've got plenty of fuel in the tank. And that has to be the kind of mindset and methodology. Think about it when my dad used to love to top off the tank of the gas tank in the car. And I use the same analogy when I talk to my kids that, one of the reasons why I scan my, glucometer or my continuous glucose monitor with my phone when I start getting hungry is I want to know what that number is. It's like, it's my body's way of letting me know, okay, we're getting close to when we need to be refueled. But in this kind of environment where we get up in the morning and we're rushing around, maybe we went to the gym, maybe didn't go to the gym, and then we grab that donut and then we sit in our car and then we go to work. It really sets us up. Like the first meal of the day, we should be thinking strategically about integrating like the protein and fats so that we stabilize that blood sugar. Because what happens when you eat that Danish right after the cortisol awakening response, right after you've gotten this influx of, raised blood sugar and cortisol increase, you're then you have more fuel in the tank. You don't need to be adding to the fuel in the tank. And I will tell my kids, actually, I have one child, 14-year-old, who's a competitive swimmer. He doesn't like to eat in the morning. And I'm constantly asked, do you encourage your kids to eat before school? The 16-year-old needs to eat. He's very hungry when he wakes up. The 14-year-old needs an hour or two before he's ready to eat. And on the weekends, I just let him, coast. And I actually have encouraged him. I'm like, I really would be interested to see if we put a CGM on you. I bet you are listening to your body's cues. You're really not hungry. And if most people would coast in the morning by not eating, they probably would not be hungry for a few hours, but they don't allow themselves an opportunity to get hungry, or to experience that kind of stomach rumbling. And even more often than not, when you hear your stomach rumbling, it's not actually that you're hungry, it's that you're dehydrated. So there are all these, we have to think beyond what we already know. Like sometimes we have to break out of patterns to figure out that maybe something is not serving us well. And so I find for a lot of people, when they get up in the morning and they just have tea or they just have coffee and they get their day started, they're much more mentally clear. And obviously this kind of feeds into it. So if you have breakfast and an hour later you want to take a nap, or 30 minutes later you want to take a nap, it's a really good barometer for letting you know that you're fueling your body with the wrong types of fuel, because you should feel energized after a meal and not sleepy.
Yeah. So for the person who says, well, why would I be tired after a meal, right? They might be like, I don't get it. Well, if you get all this glucose in the bloodstream, the body does not like to have a lot of excess glucose in the bloodstream. So what does it do? It's got to transport it into cells. The transport of glucose into the cells is energy dependent. So to a large degree, it takes energy to do that. And so if you got to get it out of the system and you got to put it somewhere, muscle, liver, or fat cells, and it's going to consume energy, it's not unusual for people to then feel tired post-meal because they consumed a bunch of energy that they're not efficient at making. And now they're in it. And now they have this low ATP state or low energy state. So, all right. So number 2 was calories in, calories out. That's not true. Is that the case?
I think this has really done a huge amount of adults an enormous disservice. And I think it's very reductionist to think it's just all about calories, because our body doesn't recognize calories. I mean, calories are a unit of energy. Yes. Our body recognizes protein, fat, and carbohydrates. And so I think it's really important for people to understand hormones drive weight gain. It's whether they're balanced or not. And I think if we have this very reductionistic methodology that all we have to do is restrict our calories and that's going to drive all these processes, I'd be the first person to say that this is one area that has been a huge departure. I mean, obviously for me, but even talking to other peers, that if you understand, as an example, when you are in a fasted state, your insulin levels are low. And if you're fat adapted, it means your body will tap into fat stores for energy and free them up, certain types of ketones. The really great ones is beta hydroxybutyrate, which will diffuse right across the blood-brain barrier, which contributes to all that mental clarity. But really explaining to people that, while you're fasting, all the things that go on behind the scenes. So the things you don't really perhaps acknowledge or understand is what drives the benefits from fasting. It's not just I'm living in a caloric deficit. And yes, I understand people say, well, it's really not about the fasting piece. It's really just eating less food. Well, it's so much more than that, because there are all these counter-regulatory mechanisms that kick in a fasted state. And that's why I think it's so important that people understand, yes, a calorie is a calorie, but our bodies don't recognize that. It's all information. When we eat food, it is providing information to our mitochondria. It's providing information to our hormones, whether they're balanced or not. And let's be clear, most of us do not have well-balanced hormones because of our lifestyles. And so this is probably the most controversial statement to make, because there are people who want to die on the CECO, the calories in, calories out sword. And then there are those of us that are like, it's complicated. It's really about hormones. And I feel like there's enough research now to really support the hypothesis that weight gain or weight loss is really mitigated by levers, if you will, certain types of hormones, whether they're balanced or not, and is not as reductionistic as some people really want to believe in it. And there are experts out there that will die on that sword. And I always just say, we're going to agree to disagree, because our body is far more sophisticated than we give it credit for.
Absolutely. And I mean, for the person who thinks it's calories in, calories out, I mean, just go on a 500 calorie a day diet and you'll find out that maybe that worked once to get to your goal weight. Maybe it worked a second time. But after a third or fourth time, it doesn't work. Your set point changes, other things change. And if it was that simple, if you did a 500 calorie deficit diet per day for 2 years, you disappear, right? If it was really that, if it was that simple. And what you see, and I work with some athletes, and when they're trying to get to their fighting weight, and what you see is they're eating less and less calories, working out harder and harder, and they're gaining weight. And it's like, hey, this doesn't make sense. My coach or my trainer said I need to burn this many calories and eat this many. I'm eating 900 calories, 1,200 calories a day. I'm like, right, but your metabolic needs are about 2,800 to 3,000 based on what you're doing, and you're creating a crisis system in your body. The way I look at physiology is that when the way the system is set up, the more calories I eat, as soon as I initially start storing calories as fat, that triggers something like leptin to be released. And that says, hey, brain, we're good. Stop eating. Leptin at low levels then triggers the conversion of T4 to T3 so that we increase the cellular machinery and metabolism to burn more fuel, to make more protein, to do more detox. And so the system is set up so more calories in, higher metabolic rate, lower calories in, lower metabolic rate. And so there is that kind of basic system in place. So when people say it's because you eat too much, that's why you have an issue, I've got problems with that, because it's not necessarily that that's always the case, because you have a skinny teenager who's consuming way more calories than maybe they do, and yet than they really need, but they're not overweight. Why? Well, because what does their body do? It has those cues to say, hey, let's go work out, let's go exercise, let's go walk, let's go swim, let's go do something, right? Innately to be more active. And so the calories get burned off, right? So somehow the body already has that system in place. I agree. It's by the time when you're starting to gain excess body fat, especially visceral body fat, that should be the clue that my metabolic rate is being challenged. It's not working as efficiently as it once did. And that's probably a bigger factor. And that's due to that chronic stress, that chronic inflammation. And it's not like it's on today and everything shuts down. It's a slow, gradual process over 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years. And then eventually it's like, oh, how did I get all this belly fat? Slow and steady, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's why it's helpful for people to have a set point at which they say, okay, I got to get my stuff together. Like whether it's you weigh yourself once a month or it's a particular type of pant or whatever, just being honest and saying, okay, we've gained a little bit of weight. Now we need to kind of ratchet back on what we're doing. Maybe I cut out the sweets and the chips, and if you drink alcohol, whatever it is, ratchet back on the things that are extraneous to kind of, work a little, eat less often.
Right.
Obviously that's always a good methodology.
How about dogma 3, which is what you eat is more important than when you eat? I think we kind of touched about that, but that's one of yours. So how is that a little bit different than kind of the breakfast point, maybe?
Well, I mean, I'm always going to talk about nutrition quality. I think it's critically important. And I find that for a lot of individuals, they're chronically under eating protein. And we know protein is the most satiating macronutrient. So macronutrients as a primer, protein, fat, and carbs, and, high quality fats. I tell everyone, if you have a piece of salmon, great. If you're having ribeye, great. You've already got your protein and your fat together. And then having non-starchy vegetables. I'm not anti-carb. But if you're metabolically unhealthy, you have to really eat high quality carbohydrates. And that's going to be from whole food sources. It does not mean pasta and bread and chips and crackers. It means, sweet potato and non-starchy vegetables and low glycemic fruit. I got accused of being anti-fruit. And I just said, hey, if you're metabolically flexible, you can have fruit. If you're not metabolically flexible, you should be having more non-starchy, vegetables. I mean, that's what we should be doing. I do think fiber is important, and this can be controversial. There are people who are full carnivore and feel that it's not necessary to consume fibers, but I do find that fiber helps people feel full, and that satiety cues, again, are critically important. So the nutrition piece, I will die on that sword. Nutrition is the quality of the food we eat is one of the most important things that we can do in honoring our bodies. I always suggest environmental working group is a great resource if you need to pick and choose between organic vegetables and fruit. Certainly buying the best protein that your budget permits is certainly helpful. And then, fats are much more dense in terms of their macronutrient ratio. So that means not eating 5 avocados a day and copious amounts of nuts and all the cheese you want. Unfortunately, those things you have to kind of be mindful about. I've seen a lot of women get into trouble with overeating cheese and nuts, as an example.
Yeah, and I think for the listeners, one of the things is I don't think you're promoting a particular diet. And I think you and I have had this conversation in the past. I think one of the worst things we've done for our community is segregate ourselves into different food religions, like the carnivore religion, the vegetarian religion, the paleo religion. And really, I think for my patients, for your patients, the focus should be on eat more whole, real food and be aware of how it makes you feel. But for the vast majority of people, if you just started eating more whole food, real food, and less processed food, you'd be healthier, right? And, you can have plants have toxins in them. Yeah, but we all need a little bit of stress, because the little bit of stress in our GI system actually makes our immune system stronger. A little bit of irritation in there. They call that the hormetic effect. Yeah. So whole food, real food, intermittent fasting, not always feeling you're like a slave to the clock to eat. You don't have to eat because it's breakfast time or any other time. I think someone wrote a book about, I think it was intuitive eating or intuitive fasting, and got slammed about that. But I think there's something to that. I'd love to get your opinion on that. And I think there is something to be aware of, listen to your body a little bit, but you can't just listen to your body, because when your physiology doesn't work well, you get cues like it's time to eat and you don't really need to eat. That's where something like a heart rate variability or a continuous glucose monitor can help. And so I think we do need to listen to our body, but we also have to have some tools to say, well, but is that really what I'm experiencing? You talked a little bit about it, but if my belly's grumbling, I must be healthy. Maybe I'm dehydrated, right?
Well, here's the thing. If you are metabolically flexible, you can intuitively eat. If you are not metabolically flexible, and most people are not, you cannot intuitively eat. So I think you can do people a disservice if the bulk of the population is metabolically unhealthy to say, oh, just listen to your body. Well, your body's cues are all rerouted. You've got leptin resistance, you've got insulin resistance. I mean, just having those two alone means the communication between your brain and your gut is dysregulated. So that really does people a disservice. Do I think there's value in saying, when I eat X food, I feel full? Yes, that awareness is important. Or when I eat X food, I feel like crap. I think it's important for people to feel a degree of empowerment, being able to say, you know what, I don't think gluten serves me. And most thyroid patients shouldn't be eating gluten, let's be frank. And that's a whole molecular mimicry conversation and dovetail we could go down if we had hours to talk. But the point of what I think both of us are saying is that intuitive fasting is a great concept. And I say great in the sense that if you're metabolically healthy, that will work. If you're not metabolically healthy, and most people are not, I think it can set people up with unrealistic expectations. I think for many people who are not metabolically healthy, their amygdala, which is kind of that primitive brain, will start thinking it's food scarcity. Like, oh my God, you're restricting food. I'm not gonna be able to get the food. And next thing you know, it overrides their prefrontal cortex. They can't make good decisions, and they will eat everything and anything in their path. And over many years of working with women in particular, this can be hugely problematic. So I think people have to lean into, baby steps. Like, what's the first thing we need to do? Let's get, pull the training wheels off, stop snacking, then move on to restructuring your macros. Because as your hormones become better acclimated, better balanced, more sensitive, the receptors are cleared off. It's almost like you need to go through a car wash or get your car detailed. As they start coming back to life, as they start communicating properly, and obviously this is an oversimplification, then you can be in a position where you could intuitively lean into what your body is trying to tell you. But I think it really sets people up for failure if we're going to tell most of our patients that they should be able to intuitively eat. I think it's a good concept. It may be tough to, kind of dispense in practice. And I know who wrote that book. And I know it was definitely well-intentioned, but the concept of intuition, you have to be open to it. And a lot of people are really disconnected from their bodies. They don't understand hunger cues. They eat for emotional reasons. They eat because they're stressed. Again, we talked about this hedonistic, dopamine-driven culture that we're in. And a lot of people, they're totally disconnected from their emotions and the choices that they make. And so that can be really challenging.
Yeah. And I figured you knew exactly what I was talking about, but I think it's important because I think the intent was good, but it's easier to have that opinion when you're on one side of the fence, mm-hmm. not so much. And for the listener, like leptin is a great indicator of whether you're going to be able to get a lot of intuitively know if you're hungry or not, because leptin is produced by your fat cells, and leptin should tell your brain, hey, I'm good. We're storing calories. We don't need any more food. But the problem is once your leptin levels start to rise about 20 or 25, no more leptin impacts the brain. And that's the point where, okay, if I'm over 20 or 25, my brain's not getting the signal appropriately. You can kind of get the idea that you're already into potentially some leptin resistance. So how are you going to really, unless you're able to step back and say, wait a minute, I've got like 30 extra pounds here. I'm not starving. But in the moment when you have signals like I'm hungry, you're going to think you're hungry, and you're going to think, I got to eat. And you may need to, because you can't make the energy efficiently. So you really might get panicky and want to eat. So intuitive eating, I think, is great. When you're optimized, yeah, you can make those kind of decisions. But when you're struggling with chronic health issues, I don't know that much of anything is very intuitive at that point.
Yeah. And I think it's important for people to understand that they could get to a point where that might be possible, but there's so much shame and blame in our culture that I just say, listen, that's not a good option for you, given the fact we know you've got this tremendous insulin and leptin resistance. And right now we need to focus on the basics. Like, really going back to the basics is so important. Like, you don't have to do something that's more, like woo-woo. And I'm not suggesting intuition is woo-woo. I'm just saying that, things that seem a little less tangible as opposed to things that are completely tangible. Like tangible is, I'm going to stop snacking. Like, I can do that.
So I want to talk, because I still want to get to the benefits of the book, but there's 3 hormones that you kind of talk about, and I want to give them time. And for the patients who are listening, they're like, hey, what about thyroid stuff? This all pertains, but you talk about 3 big hormones right in the beginning of the book and kind of carry into that through, and how important they are. And when you talk about blame, I think we blame insulin maybe sometimes inappropriate. You and I may not necessarily agree. We'll see. But I think insulin gets a really, really bad rap. And so I want you to kind of talk about the 3 hormones that you talk about being really, really important. And then we'll talk a little bit more about insulin, because I think that's one of those key things. I think cortisol and insulin, 2 hormones that everybody's heard about. Oxytocin, definitely not the dudes. but maybe women. But let's talk about those three hormones, and then we'll jump into insulin and the cortisol story.
Yeah. So oxytocin is really, I think of it as the mother of all hormones. It orchestrates how we interact with our environment. It's exceedingly important. I think women think of it like as bonding with their babies while they're breastfeeding, when you are coupled with your partner during orgasm. But you can get oxytocin hits throughout the day, just like hugging your loved ones, hugging your dog. Like I have 2 dogs, and I jokingly tell my husband I'd love to have a third. But doing things that bring you joy. So oxytocin is that joy hormone. We know it also has a positive net impact on cortisol. So when people are saying they're like super stressed, the first thing I say is you need to get some oxytocin hits, because when we release it in our bodies, it only lasts for a couple minutes. So you need to kind of have oxytocin fueled interactions throughout the day. And when I'm talking about things that bring you joy, it could be reading a book. Like I'm the kind of sciencey nerd person. Like I'm so happy when I'm learning. Like that's a happy place for me to be. Might not be for other people, but it doesn't necessarily involve that you have to do things with other people, but it's just doing things that bring you joy. And when oxytocin is secreted, it has a nice buffering effect on cortisol. And I think there's no one listening who hasn't had more stress in the last 2 years. And so we actively have to work at buffering cortisol. Cortisol, like insulin, gets a really bad rap. I always say cortisol is there to help us survive. It is one of those hormones that allowed us to adapt and change as a species. Unfortunately, in our overharried, overstressed existence, in this dopamine-driven 24/7 lifestyle that most of us lead, our bodies think we're running a marathon every single day. So we're really good at being sympathetic dominant. So autonomic nervous system, you get the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic. Not enough parasympathetic. Parasympathetics rest and repose. That's when we can poop and have an orgasm. And it means it's the time when we can digest our food and detoxify. So really, really important. I think about how many people I know that stand up when they eat, or they're yelling at their kids, or they eat in their car, or, they're never in a position where they can literally be relaxed enough to go to the bathroom. And these kinds of things are important. We have to have balance. It's like a seesaw. But most of us tend to be sympathetic driven. We're go, 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 go all the time, or being chased by a rabid animal. So blood shunts to our extremities. We get very focused. But cortisol over time, if we're not having enough balance, can impact blood sugar, can impact gut health, can impact immune function. Again, it exceeds the time frame of our discussion to go into all the nuances, but cortisol has a net impact on nearly every other system in the body. And when our body is really stressed, it impacts sex hormones, it impacts thyroid hormone. I mean, it has the potential in a chronic stress state to dysregulate all of these things and keep our blood sugar high, which keeps our insulin high. And so much to the point of what you had said about insulin gets a bad rap, cortisol gets a bad rap. They're meant to balance one another. They're meant to work together as a system in the body. But in our current hedonistic lifestyles, we have an over focus on this sympathetic drive in the body. In fact, for a lot of us, like I wear an Oura ring, I know what my heart rate variability is. I knew what heart rate variability was in cardiology, but now it's a completely different focus. And I tell people, like, those numbers, it's good data. It tells me, like, how balanced am I? Am I sympathetic driven and the numbers are low, or am I balanced? Like, am I in the 70s and 80s because my parasympathetic is more active and more at play, and we want to have that balance piece. So I think on so many levels, we think of these hormones, if we're aware of them, in one plane, but they have so many downstream effect on one another. Like every single hormone has an effect on another hormone. It's like the domino effect. And insulin gets a really bad rap because everyone thinks insulin's bad. When insulin's working well, it's a beautiful thing. It's secreted in response to your blood sugar going up. It should come back down. When it's low, we have all these, wonderful benefits from, the improvement of our biophysical markers and the secretion of ketones that fuel our brain and allow us to have a lot of mental clarity. Good example, I'm doing a long fast today, and I'm doing this entire podcast completely fasted. And it's a great way to kind of interact with our environment. Now, I'm not sure if you wanted me to go into more detail or if that's the level of detail you were looking for, but obviously everything impacts the thyroid. Like all of these hormones have a direct impact on the thyroid without question.
Yeah, I think the key comes down to, like, we look at these things like they're individual or the one-off, or the high cortisol is the problem, or the high insulin is the problem, or the problem is you're insulin resistant, when in reality, I think everything's a web of function or web of dysfunction. And so I think we have to get away in functional medicine saying, oh, the reason you have a problem is your cortisol is too high, I need to suppress it with something, or your cortisol is too low, therefore you have adrenal fatigue, or your insulin's too high, and therefore that's what's causing you to have a problem. And we have to lower insulin. Well, there are a lot of people who have let me say it this way. You have 4 hormones that will raise your glucose: cortisol, epinephrine, glucagon, and growth hormone. All are designed. And when you're in that stress response that Cynthia was talking about, the sympathetic dominance, not only do you have cortisol pumping out glucose, you have epinephrine pumping out glucose. And so you only have one hormone to lower your glucose, and that is insulin. And so we have to ask the question is, because what you get is blamed. When your insulin level's high, your fasting glucose is high, somebody looks at you and says, well, obviously you're eating too much sugar and carbohydrates, and that's the reason you have high insulin, or you're diabetic and pre-diabetic. And there's a lot of people who've done dieting, they've done intermittent fasting, they don't eat carbohydrates, they're carnivore, and yet they have high fasting insulins, and there's somebody looks at them like it's their fault and they're to blame. And I think the key part is, when we look at those hormones, is that we have to not blame the hormone or say, oh, it's because you're resistant, right? And to ask the better question, like, well, why does my cells not want the glucose? Why is it forcing it into fat cells? Instead of blaming the hormone, we need to ask the better question, because there's a lot of people who have insulin resistance, high insulin. Well, why is it elevated? I haven't eaten in 14 hours. Why is my insulin still high? And I guess my argument, when we look at those things, and for a lot of the people who struggle, even when they do intermittent fasting, is at the root of their issue is some type of chronic cell stress response. And I always say the body either operates in a low state homeostatic manufacturing mode, where it wants lots of food energy and it's going to convert it into lots of great stuff, or it's operating in danger mode. And in that situation, we're trying to reduce the amount of glucose, reduce the amount of nutrients coming into a cell, and instead push those into storage, because there's a threat, there's a bacteria, there's a virus, there's something that our body is trying to protect the cell from. And that is what drives insulin resistance in many cases. That's what's driving more body fat storage. That's driving the chronic inflammation. And so time-restricted eating is a great tool to help address those things. But if somebody is struggling, even though they're doing time-restricted eating or intermittent fasting with low calories, and they're doing it and it's not working, and somebody says, well, it's because you're high insulin, you're eating too much carbohydrates, you have to be like, whoa, wait a minute, there's something else going on here that the body is trying to help me do. And one of the benefits of intermittent fasting is to help in that process of cell protection, because when you do intermittent fasting, what it does is helps activate the autophagy processes that help find and kill some of those threats. So can you talk about that a little bit before we get into the book a little bit more and finish up, so you can get back to your work and life?
Yeah. No, I think autophagy and this scientific principle, or if we talk about mitophagy, the waste and recycling of mitochondria, is a really important topic for people to understand, especially given the global climate that we're still in. Having the ability to allow your body to go in and get rid of things that don't belong. It's like taking out the trash. That's the easiest way to explain it. Whether it's diseased organelles, mitochondria, et cetera, your body can go in and get rid of them. But the caveat is it doesn't do this work efficiently when you're in a fed state. There's mTOR and autophagy that kind of balance one another out. Remember, the body's always looking for balance. But when we're in a non-fed state, we have the innate ability to go in and get rid of things that do not belong. And this is particularly important, not just for viruses and, microbial threats, but I'm thinking about even disease states like precancerous cells and things that our body can innately go in and get rid of. And, as I said, take out the trash during this state. And this is why sometimes longer fasts can be beneficial. This is why people want to get nuanced over, oh my God, I only fasted for 14 hours. Somehow I didn't have enough autophagy. And I just say, listen, depends on your goals. It depends on what's going on in your personal life. Yes, if you fast for 24 hours, there will be more autophagy than if you fast for 16. But that doesn't mean you're still not doing benefits for your body. And it's not as if autophagy just gets shut off. It's really more, it's a continuum. And we want to accelerate things. We want to understand physiologically what's happening in the body when we're in this non-fed state. And so, yes, autophagy is one of those principles in particular that I like people to really understand, because when you eat, this is not the process that predominates. There's another process in the body that will predominate in response to food intake. And certainly different types of foods, different types of supplements, different types of things can potentiate autophagy. But it's important for people to understand that fasting is one way that you can potentiate autophagy successfully.
And if you think about it, most of us the older we get, the more our lifestyle gets compromised, the more we're living in more of that cell stress, cell danger response type of physiology. The cells are actively trying to engage more of that potentially autophagy, mitophagy process. Yet we're flooding the system with calories that then need to be addressed, and they got to go somewhere. And so they're got to go to storage, and that's going to be fat. So what I want to do in these last couple minutes here is just have you kind of talk about the book and the benefits of the book and why this book, it's written by you, female opinion and from a female view, but what is somebody going to learn over those 45 days what's the reason they want to go get this? They're going to, obviously, this is a great tool to learn a lot of the stuff we talked about. It's a 45-day program, but really it's a lifestyle program. What's the big key pieces they're going to get from this book?
Yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, it's an opportunity to really hear a bit about my story and a program that I developed uniquely for women. So whether you are peak fertile years, you're in perimenopause or menopause, so irrespective of what life continuum you're on, this book can serve your needs. And that's unique. I don't think that there's anything else out there that's like it. And I feel comfortable saying that, but it's also going to empower you. It's going to give you the information to know when not to fast and when to fast, to know how to fast successfully, doing different variations of fasting, to be able to integrate foods and supplements that can potentiate some of the benefits of fasting. And then there's 50 recipes in the back. And then there's, an appendix of different types of vendors that I work directly with that have great high quality. Like I'll use an example. Redmond's has amazing salt, and I'm a big fan of my patients and clients using electrolytes during their fast. And so seasoning your food, especially with salt, high quality salt, is one huge benefit. So to me, it's like having me in your pocket. Literally, if you're listening to the audiobook, which I just finished recording, or having, me and my voice. It's like me coaching you through IF45, it stands for Intermittent Fasting 45, but it's a 45-day program in the book. But it's all of my best, all the best research, all of the best strategies and suggestions so that you can fast for your hormones. Here's the other thing. We can't fast like men. We have to fast a little differently. And this book winds all those things together for you.
Awesome. So when does the book officially come out? So people, I know they could pre-order it now, but when does it officially come out?
March 15th. And the cool thing is if you pre-order the book, you have access to all the pre-sale bonuses. And my team and I really endeavored to make sure the pre-sale bonuses are things that would potentiate or improve the quality of your results with the book. So those will go away when we hit publication date. So if you purchase the book before the 15th of March, you'll have access to all of them. And we spent a lot of time being thoughtful. I just know that as a consumer, I don't like throwaway bonuses that some authors give. We wanted to make sure that these would really take your results from IF45 up a notch.
Awesome. And when is the audiobook coming out the same time?
I think so. I literally just finished the edits on Monday. So it was like 4 days of recording.
Okay. Because I'm a big audio person. I like books like yours, especially if the author has signed it, because there's a certain energy that comes with that book, right? And then it feels more personal. But I'm geeky. I'm usually reading journals, but books and things I love on audio. So I can't wait to see the book come out, hear the book. I've already read through the book, but I want to hear it in your voice. I think you doing your own voice to a book gives us a special touch to it. So we'll wrap this up. I got another like 10 hours of questions. Maybe we can do this in after March when the book comes back out. We'll have another conversation, talk a little bit deeper about it. But if somebody wants more Cynthia, where can they go? Obviously, they're going to get the book, but where else can they go to get more content?
So obviously, my website's a great resource, www.cynthiathurlow.com. I have a great podcast for which you have been on twice, and you were one of the most downloaded episodes from 2021, Everyday Wellness. On social media, I'm very active on Instagram. I have a private free Facebook group. It's Intermittent Fasting Lifestyle / my name. And if you follow me on Twitter, I'm a little snarky. So I'll just forewarn everyone. It's where I kind of get I kind of get a sense. I'll throw content out and see what sticks. But Twitter is really the manosphere. So it's an interesting place to exist as a woman. But those are probably the easiest ways to connect with me.
Awesome. Well, I thank you for coming on the podcast. I'm thrilled you got the book coming out. I'm still working on finalizing mine. I've got a meeting with my publisher as soon as we get done here. But congratulations on getting the book out. I as one know how much work it is to get it all done. So good for you. We'll get this podcast out and make sure everybody knows it's coming out. And then we'll start talking about the book afterwards too. So thanks for coming on. Have a great holiday, great weekend, great everything. Okay.
Thanks. You too.
All right. Take care.